Big Brother, mainstream media, government cover-ups. You want answers? Well, so does he. He's Alex Jones on the GCN Radio Network. And now, live from Austin, Texas, Alex Jones.
Welcome to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and I'll be your host today. Paul Joseph Watson is going to be joining us at the bottom of the hour, and we're going to be discussing Harry Reid's comments about domestic terrorists. Who are the real terrorists? What is the real law going on here? We're going to have that discussion. It's good that this is out in the open. It's good that we're seeing where people are falling, on which side they're falling. It's good to see the mainstream media having this discussion, and we're going to talk about what some people who have identified themselves as alternative media are saying about this, like Glenn Beck, for example. Alex Jones is also going to be joining us later in the show, and we've got some updates on the Bundy Ranch, as well as people now trying to dissect this. Like I said, we've now got some comments from Rand Paul and others, some excellent comments from Judge Napolitano. He's been on target on this from the very beginning, saying things like, this is a legal case. If they win in court, then they get a lien, and then when the guy dies, they take his property, or when he sells it, they take his property. You don't send an army in. And that's the battle right now in the info war. We've got people like Glenn Beck in the mainstream media who are doing everything they can to portray this as an act of aggression by people who peacefully stood up to tyranny that had been going on for over a week. This case has been going on for decades. But the army that went down there, that was really, really escalating. Just before we got down there to file our reports, of course, as you've seen, they attacked people with tasers, with canine dogs. They came up behind a woman, threw her down from behind. Okay, they're beating people up, and we're seeing this happening everywhere. This is what liberals need to understand. This is not about the cattle. This isn't about white people versus colored people or people of color or what. This is not about any of those things. This isn't about a rich rancher. He's not rich. It's not about Mormons versus other people. Everybody's throwing in all of these personal issues to try to attack them because of whatever group they're involved in. It's not about that. We cover stories all the time about people of every age, race, sex, color, whatever, being attacked by the government, being killed by the government, who are never, and the agents who do this, the law enforcement people who do this, are never brought to heel over this. This is out of control. And this is what's changing. This is what it was about. It was about facing down tyranny. And we have to have this discussion. We need to talk about who the real terrorists are. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about some other interesting things that are happening. Now, as this was going on this last week, we had the income tax took place, okay, on federal forms were filled out. And I thought it was very interesting. We didn't have time to cover this because so much was happening in Nevada. But the Donald Rumsfeld letter that came out that everybody was talking about, he said every year he writes a letter to the IRS and says, my taxes are a known unknown, as only Donald Rumsfeld can put it. He sends a letter every year and says, I really have no idea what's in this. It's a very complicated situation, and he feels uncomfortable essentially signing his name to a declaration that can be used to say that he created perjury. That's what a lot of people have said. I always had that problem. I never sent him a letter like that because I wasn't Donald Rumsfeld. He's pretty much inoculated against being prosecuted. Wouldn't it be ironic if Donald Rumsfeld became the leader of a tax protest movement? If everybody were to fill that out, because they don't like it if you don't fill it out. They've had an airline pilot who had no complications in his tax form. He merely had wages, and he refused to sign it. They took him to court because he refused to sign it. He said, that you're requiring me to do self-incrimination. Well, of course, there's a lot of things that the IRS is being used for nowadays, and used openly. They were always used to punish political enemies of both Democrats and Republicans. That is why they're reluctant, really, to do anything about the IRS being openly used to attack Tea Party members. They want that power when they get back in. That's what the Republicans want. They want to try to score some political points, but they want the power when they come back. So we're going to be talking about that. We also have reports from the New York Times that an American bank had a plane that landed in Tehran. And the American government and the Iranian government is not talking about this, but as we had on InfoWars today, bankers are behind the wars. A story from Naomi Prinz, who was just on the show yesterday. We're going to be right back. Your calls also on the Bundy Ranch. Friday, April 18th, 2014, Good Friday. And we've got a big report here. There's a breaking story, very important story that's just went up on InfoWars. White House Counterterror Chief from Homeland Security, that's Lisa Monaco, is saying that confrontational children could be terrorists. She's warning parents and telling them to watch their kids. Presumably, if they see their kids do something and maybe be a little bit rebellious, maybe they ought to call Homeland Security. You know, see something, say something to a whole new level. And Alex Jones has a breaking report on that. I've got Alex on the phone right now. We're going to play his report. Alex, what do you make of this?
Well, there's two things that go together. And this is the biggest day of broadcast we've ever done. This is the most important issue we've ever covered concerning this republic. History repeats itself. I've studied the globalist. I've studied the Homeland Security system. We were the first to break all this. I'm not bragging. I'm saying people need to listen to me very carefully, because now everything is 2 inches away from our face, not 20 miles away over the horizon. This is happening now. We have the video coming up. It's up on Infowars.com in Paul Watson's article. That's the top featured story from last night, titled, Harry Reid Says Bundy Protesters Are Domestic Terrorists. We're going to be playing that video when Paul Watson comes up at the bottom of the hour to break all this down. He says that we wanted to kill women and children by putting them up front. No, that's what the feds did when they bombed Oklahoma City with the daycare center. Yeah. He says twice they're domestic terrorists, and he's working with the FBI to go after them. Now we have the White House chief of counterterrorism, a known complete globalist socialist, openly saying that your children may be terrorists if they literally throw a toy. Now, people say this sounds crazy, this sounds funny. No, it's not funny. They arrest kids for Nerf guns at school the teacher tells them to bring. They arrest kids if they draw a picture of their dad who's in the Marine Corps. They're training everyone for thought police, where you will be disappeared. This is an authoritarian psych warfare program. These are not environmentalist wackos. They're using it to take over. This is not a failed drug war. They ship the drugs in. This is not a failed, whacked-out woman just demonizing her opposition. This is scientific, saying trust no one but the state. Walmart has telescreens across the country saying don't trust anyone but Homeland Security. Terrorists may be everywhere, while the government openly funds al-Qaeda to attack nations like Syria. It is totally naked. They think you're that stupid, ladies and gentlemen. In 24 hours, she went on television. We have that clip coming up as well. It's at the bottom of the article, where she says, and she gave another speech at Harvard repeating the same thing, saying seriously that, hey, your kids may be terrorists. Everyone's a terrorist. Everyone's a terrorist, but the real terrorists that took over America. I'm going to say this very slowly. It's not rhetoric, ladies and gentlemen. This is an occupation, global foreign banking government. Homeland Security is meant to absorb the old republic. My God, folks, Homeland Security is a Nazi term. It's the uniforms, all of it. It's totally naked. The armored vehicles being deployed. They want to start a civil war before the full Depression hits, to blame the Depression on the Civil War, to blame a war in Ukraine on the Depression. I've been telling everyone this for 6 years, every day. I know the enemy. The enemy writes public manuals admitting all this. So we're going to go to my special report. David Knight's going to cover it. Everyone's going to cover it. We've got to get on the offensive right now and let the globalists know that we understand their plan. We've got to stop a shootout with the feds. We've got to stop a civil war. We've got to stop a civil war. We've got to expose their paradigm as they try to play us off against each other like two Siamese fighting fish. I'm going to hand things over to you, David Knight. We'll play my report, and then Paul Watson is coming up. This is what zero tolerance is about, teaching us all that we're terrorists who can be disappeared under the NDAA. This is their attempt to flip the script, from saying it's al-Qaeda to it's all of us. This is the criminal rogue government armed to the teeth against us, belligerently saying, you will go in your free speech zones, you will shut up, or we will arrest you for terrorism. This is the New World Order takeover. This proves everything I ever said. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a maximum red alert to call Congress, to call everybody, to call talk radio. That's why Glenn Beck is scared to now saying anybody who opposes or criticizes the government's a terrorist, because he said 3 years ago they're going to bomb stuff and blame it on the liberty movement like Oklahoma City, and he showed their own documents on Fox News. He knows. A lot of people are going to get scared now and join with the New World Order out of fear because they're going to stage false flags and blame it on us. Unless we maximum expose this right now and call the media, call the system, get on the streets everywhere, and let people know that we're aware of what they're doing. And when there is a false flag, you've got to run to the false flag with your video cameras, because the feds and the globalists are so sloppy, you will probably see them literally running out with bombs and things like at Oklahoma City. We're going to get their names, just like the underwear bomber. That was the CIA. Our witnesses were correct. We're going to get the names like the Boston bombing. We are going to expose what they're doing. God bless you, David Knight. We'll be covering it Sunday as well. This is a maximum issue as they announce that we are all terrorists. We are all suspects, except for the out-of-control government run by foreign banks. David Knight, thank you very much.
Absolutely right, Alex. That's why it was so imperative that we be there. That's why we weren't shooting pictures from the overpass. We have to see what's going on. People needed to see that the narrative that they're putting out there now about us strategizing to put women and children out front, Sheriff Mack has now backed off of that. He says, I wasn't there. I didn't get there till after that happened. He was just talking about it afterwards. We have the video. We show that the people were not acting in a threatening way whatsoever. It was the SWAT teams on the other side that were pointing guns at us. It was the SWAT team, as they had been all week. It was the SWAT team on the other side that continued to bark orders, leave the area or we will shoot. We will use lethal force. That's what was happening there. And yet you see Reuters, you see Glenn Beck trying to spin this into the fact that the only people that were carrying guns were the protesters. That was not the case. You can see that nobody on the front line had any guns. Nobody was doing anything threatening. If they had any guns, they were in holsters on their sides. The only person that I've seen a picture of somebody was someone up on the overpass, and they have run that over and over again. And guess what? Most of those pictures were aerial views. They were shooting from a helicopter. They had a no-fly zone in the area. Everybody was hopelessly outgunned. It wasn't, they didn't stand down because they were outgunned. I'm glad there were people there that had guns. I'm glad there were people there that were backing us up. That's very important. We cannot lose that. That is a deterrence. And it can be a peaceful deterrence, just like nuclear weapons. But let's go, while we still have time, let's go to this. Actually, we don't have time to play it now, do we? We're going to have a commercial break. So let's finish up with this. We're going to play it right after the commercial break. We're going to go right into Alex Jones's report. I wanted to read this report from Reuters that's up on Drudge. After Nevada ranch standoff, emboldened militia ask where next? In other words, like the militia, these people who were there as peaceful civil rights protesters are somehow the problem. Listen to this first paragraph. Flat on his belly in a sniper position, wearing a baseball cap and a flak jacket, a protester aimed his semi-automatic rifle from the edge of an overpass and waited as a crowd below stood its ground against U.S. federal agents in the Nevada desert. You read on and on and on this article. There is no mention of the fact that the federal agents were armed. There's no mention of the fact that they were pointing guns at people there all week. There's no mention of the brutality that went on, initiated by the federal government. Nobody that was there as a protester, nobody there that was watching what was going on and protesting it, initiated any force against the federal government. But of course, you've got the Southern Poverty Law Center coming in and saying, laws, I guess, don't apply when the radical right doesn't agree with it. Well, we can have that discussion about what the laws are, but as Representative Stockman here in the U.S., in Texas, as well as U.S. Senator Rand Paul have both pointed out, this kind of escalation is totally unwarranted. Representative Stockman pointed out that whenever the government has to use force to enforce an order, they have to use, on a contract basis, local law enforcement authority. They should have been using the sheriff's department if they were going to do that. They should not have brought in contract killers. And then the only time they mention that the federal government has weapons is way down in the article where they quote Alex Jones. They describe him as a radio host, anti-government conspiracy theorist whose popular right-wing website InfoWars helped to popularize Bundy's dispute, called it a watershed moment. And this is what Alex said. He said, Americans showed up with guns and said, no, you're not, before confronting armed BLM agents. Only time in the piece that they're talking about the government agents being armed. Other than that, they're portrayed as peaceful bystanders who are just being set upon by an angry mob. That's the kind of distortion that they're putting out. But Alex went on and said, they said, shoot us, the protesters that is, and they didn't. And that was epic. And it is going to happen more. I hope it will happen more because people need to wake up, especially people on the left. They're trying to make this about they're buying into the hate. They're buying into the group division, pitting one group against another because, as I said before, because of religion or because of race or whatever. It's not about that. We cover stories about an out-of-control government, about abusive, authoritarian police state tactics, and the fact that the government is never called to account about that. We cover those stories all the time, all over the country. Usually it's in a city where this is happening. Usually it's to black people, you know, and we cover that. And we need to wake up. And we need to stand these people down. And we need to make sure they're going to follow the law. One of the things that made this work here was that they had something they could give up. They had the cattle that they could give up. In most cases, like I think the Occupy movement, the problem most protests is they don't have a clear objective. They don't offer the other side a way to step down. We need to offer them a way to step down. But it needs to be about something much broader than the cattle. But that's a good thing. If we got something right there, that's a good thing. We're going to be back, and we're going to play right away Alex Jones's groundbreaking story. The White House tells parents that children could be terrorists. Stay tuned. We're going to be right back. You need to hear this.
Uncover a simple premise.
Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight. Now, in the last segment, we just had Alex on, and he was talking about how yesterday Harry Reid emphasized that the peaceful protesters at the Bundy Ranch standoff were domestic terrorists. And then this morning, we have this breaking news from Homeland Security warning parents that confrontational children could become terrorists. As Alex said, the guns are no longer off in the distance. What we've been telling you for years is now coming in your face. Here's that report from Alex.
Ladies and gentlemen, I told you this was coming. I told you the Bundy Ranch situation could be the new 1776. The globalists openly have converted Homeland Security over to a system to wage domestic war on political enemies. It was set up for that. You've heard in the news about the documents that we and others got that the government admits are real, where they list gun owners, conservatives, libertarians, returning veterans, and Christians as the main terror threat. The FBI now admits that. That's who they're targeting. Not the globalists that are funding al-Qaeda publicly in Syria, Libya, and other areas. No, it's we the people. The Pentagon is trying to take on gun owners. This is a criminal takeover. Well, now Harry Reid, we have the video on Infowars.com, it's linked on DrudgeReport.com, came out last night and said he's talked to the head of the FBI, Homeland Security, all of them, that the Bundys basically are domestic terrorists. Their supporters are, who wanted to, quote, kill children. He actually says that. And they had automatic weapons. So, continuing here, ladies and gentlemen, he has now openly come out and said this, and we have the video right here on Infowars.com. So you need to go there. You can see the video on the site. Now, continuing, on top of that, White House Counterterror Chief says confrontational children could be terrorists, and the video is posted right there. I'm not joking. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what is really behind all of this? Look at this headline. New York Daily News. Kids suspended for bringing Nerf guns to school with teachers' permission. Kids get suspended if their neighbors see them playing with Nerf guns in their backyard. You can pull that article up. You say it makes no sense. You say it's crazy. You say it's nuts to claim that little kids are basically, some type of criminal for having guns, toy guns. Or you see these reports now saying that if a baby throws its bottle, that could be a major indicator that they're a terrorist. This is about making everyone criminal but the people running the system. This is about the rollout of a total authoritarian system, a total and complete nanny state, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what we're breaking down every day here at Infowars.com. What we're seeing is the branding of any type of even speech against tyranny as terrorism. The free speech zones, the NSA spying, all of it is part of this system. So before people make jokes, and I see folks making jokes in the comments saying these people are crazy, these people are nuts, You know, the dog's aggressive. Is it a terrorist? You got to understand, this is social engineering. This is a plan they're rolling out. This is why if a kid makes the image of their finger as a gun, bang, bang, in school, they get arrested. This is why if you ask a cop why you've been pulled over, you get tasered or taken to jail. It's a paramilitary takeover. Okay, this is literal mind control where they're expanding terrorism to everyone. First they roll it out to fight Al-Qaeda. Then they say, forget about Al-Qaeda. It's for you and your family. And now they're going to continue to grab land under 121. They're going to continue to raise the taxes. They're going to continue to harass everybody until people start resisting. Then they're going to call it terrorism. Then they're going to stage terror attacks, blame it on their political opposition, and bring in martial law. This is their plan. This is what I keep warning you about. Please, for military, police, and others, understand what's happening. Understand that America is being shut down, deindustrialized, and the people are in a depression. And this is designed to create tension that the globalists can then basically use to bring in their next level of control. We've got to find a third way out of this. We've got to realize the globalist plan and the program that they're carrying out. David Knight's going to be hosting the show today. I'll be calling in repeatedly as well and doing work behind the scenes. Infowars.com for the free live feeds. And remember, if you're watching this transmission, you are the resistance to the foreign banks that have seized control of the government. These are their political commissar, political officers, literally taking over the society. It's really happening. Children, parents, don't trust your children. They could be terrorists. This is on mainstream news with the White House counterterrorism chief. This is really happening. This is really unfolding, ladies and gentlemen, as I told you it would. Homeland Security is the takeover arm to shut down America and bring in the New World Order. Similar systems have been set up worldwide. Alex Jones signing off for Infowars.com. Get these stories out to people. This is a plan. They know what they're doing. This is a plan. Alex Jones again signing off.
We're going to be right back with Paul Joseph Watson. He wrote the articles about Harry Reid emphasizing that peaceful protesters against the police state were domestic terrorists, and the government Homeland Security pitting parents against children. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and I have Paul Joseph Watson from London on the phone, one of our staff writers here. And Paul wrote several key stories the last couple of days about what's going on in the press. Now, we've had the story that he wrote yesterday, Harry Reid calling Cliven Bundy supporters domestic terrorists. And then the story that broke this morning that he wrote, White House counterterrorism chief says that confrontational children could be terrorists. So parents, watch out for them. This is, as Alex just said in his report, this is social engineering for the police state. Paul, welcome.
Hi, David.
This is pretty amazing. They're really stepping this rhetoric up. And, you know, these were peaceful people protesting the police state. And they're the ones now, the media is spinning this, as well as the government trying to talk about how these people were threatening the government. The government had been threatening and attacking people all week. It was the government that was threatening us the entire time we were standing there. And as people were gradually milling forward, they were threatening to shoot. They actually, a Fox News reporter tried to get closer because he was having trouble hearing. He wanted to interview somebody up there. He was walking forward saying, Fox News, lifting up his shirt, stopping, and they waved him off. They wouldn't let him come by. They were the ones who were threatening people. They were threatening reporters as well as anyone who was in the area.
Well, first off, David, I'd like to commend you on the excellent coverage. I was watching the stream last weekend at the Bundy Ranch, and obviously we received a ton of positive messages, so kudos to you on that coverage.
And Josh was there with me, too. He was filming as well. So, and Josh is going to be going to Boston with Jakari Jackson to see what police state measures they're doing there, because that is, I think, one of the most important elements. There's so many elements about this. There's Agenda 21, there's the political corruption and everything, but this police state issue is now the one that is bubbling up to the top, isn't it, Paul?
Exactly, and the article today, which ties into all this, is White House counter-terror chief says confrontational children could be terrorists, and this is Lisa Monaco, who is Obama's chief Homeland Security and counter-terror advisor. She came out in a speech on Tuesday night and followed it up in subsequent press appearances and said, quote, what kinds of behaviors are we talking about? For the most part, they're not related directly to plotting attacks. They're more subtle. For instance, parents might see sudden personality changes in their children at home becoming confrontational. So she's actually talking about the radicalization of children into becoming terrorists. And the behavior that denotes that possibility is children becoming confrontational with their own parents. What child, what teenager isn't at some point confrontational with their parents?
That's
so,
right.
As I extrapolated out in this article, again, the term terrorism, the term domestic terrorism, as used by Harry Reid yesterday, it's clearly lost all meaning because it's been so overused as this tool to demonize political activism that it's become completely meaningless altogether. And you can see that they're now engaging in this program, which Alex has talked about on the video you just played. It's a mass reclassification of deviant behavior. It's about behavioral control, because they're trying to define any political activism or any mere belief that's adversarial to the state. They're characterizing it as radical and dangerous. So it's the fear-driven implementation of thought crime.
Yes.
You know, they're not doing it because necessarily they plan to go out and round up and arrest millions of libertarians or constitutionalists. They're doing it to dissuade people on the outside from becoming interested in these kind of ideas in the first place. So it's
for self-censorship.
Preemptive.
Yeah, self-censorship as well as perhaps some drugs. You know, they've already got a condition that they created just a couple of years ago called ODD. You know, I'm sure they started with that acronym. They say if you have oppositional defiant disorder, right? And that's what it looks like they're talking about. They're trying to set this up. Are they going to do something maybe like they did with ADD and drugging all the boys in school with Ritalin, because it's almost entirely boys that they give Ritalin to?
Exactly. And the legacy for that, of course, is the former Soviet Union,
yes,
where they had these psychushkas, these mental hospitals, which were used by the state as prisons in order to intern political dissidents. And in fact, a Soviet psychiatry expert at the institute at the time said that it was about ideas about a struggle for truth and justice are formed by personalities with a paranoid structure. So they were classifying adversarial ideas against the state as a form of psychosis. And then in 2009, Psychology Today came out with an article which viciously attacked us, which basically said the same thing, that this oppositional defiant disorder was manifesting itself in the political arena. People who were suspicious of the state could have a form of psychosis. And then, of course, at the same time, you had leaked Homeland Security reports saying people reverent of individual liberty. They weren't even talking about being a part of a political party or supporting a candidate. Merely being reverent of individual liberty was a characterization, a sign of potential terrorism. So it shifted from the psychiatric arena, declaring people who have anti-statist ideas as being potentially mentally ill, and now they've shifted it into the political battlefield, saying, you know, we're all right-wing extremist radicals who want violence.
So much for the idea of the loyal opposition, right? Just give those people the blue pill and tell them to shut up, or we'll commit them to an institution.
It's absolutely chilling, and its legacy is in the most draconian totalitarian states throughout history.
Yes.
But now, of course, as you said, the whole push is about Bundy supporters being violent. And yet the only violence during that whole standoff over the course of the past couple of weeks was carried out by the BLM feds when they tasered Bundy family members, when they assaulted pregnant women and cancer victims during that early standoff before the main one. And as he said, the people escalating the violent rhetoric, as Harry Reid did yesterday, were again the BLM agents. I mean, you were there on the front lines. You heard them saying, threatening that they would shoot people.
Yes.
So they're the ones engaging in violence. They're the ones engaging in violent rhetoric. And yet the mass media lays all that on Bundy supporters when they were they played the key role in keeping that standoff peaceful.
The mass of people there were, I don't know how long it was. I guess we were there for maybe about an hour. We had to wait for the mounted people to get there, whatever. But they were threatening us the entire time. I never heard anybody threatening to shoot them, but they were on a loudspeaker threatening to shoot us. One of the things, Paul, that bothers me about this was early in the week, it was actually Glenn Beck who got out in front and led the charge. He had an interview with Cliven Bundy, and in that interview, he started talking about the legal issues. And Glenn Beck spun this to say, oh, so you're saying that you're sovereign over all this. And then he had a guy that was there in the studio with him and said, Mr. Bundy, are you part of the sovereign citizen movement? Now, you and I know what that is. Mr. Bundy had never heard that term before. I know that the FBI has listed as one of their top groups, people that they identify, that they label as sovereign citizens. They label them as domestic terrorists, and they have pushed this narrative. They've pushed this label out to law enforcement so that if they label somebody as a sovereign citizen, law enforcement officers now believe that their lives are in immediate danger from someone that has that label. That was one of the most irresponsible things I've ever seen anywhere, and they got out in front of everybody else and called him something he had no idea of, and he was never saying that he was sovereign. He was saying that the county, that the state was sovereign. And as a matter of fact, we have Representative Stockman from Texas said that today, pointed out that the federal law says that if they're going to use force to enforce some kind of a federal judgment or anything else, they need to contract with local law enforcement. That's the federal law. They were the ones who were breaking the law. They were the ones who sent in an army of people from all over the country. They were the ones who were pointing snipers at everybody. That's what Harry Reid said. He said there were hundreds and hundreds of people from around the country that came there. Yeah, federal agents. They also had sniper rifles. Federal agents. They had weapons, automatic weapons. Federal agents. They had children lined up. That wasn't the federal agents. That wasn't us either. That was somebody who was not even there talking about what he thought was going to be done or what he thought would be a good idea. Nobody talked about that, and as we showed, that did not happen.
And then you've got the so-called lawlessness of Bundy. Well, the actual court order that the feds got against him did not give them any right to seize his property, did not give them any right to shoot dead his cattle, which evidence has now emerged, didn't give them any right to destroy his property, which evidence of which has also now emerged. So they broke the law. And even if you agree, even if you stand on the side of the feds, as Glenn Beck does, as Judge Andrew Napolitano pointed out, all they've got the power to do is put a lien on his property and try and claim back the so-called grazing fees that way. They have no legal right to go and steal his property, to shoot his cattle, and to intimidate peaceful protesters. But now they've opened it up and labeled all the Bundy supporters as terrorists, as Harry Reid did last night. That opens it up to, NDAA, indefinite detention without trial. It opens it up to drone strikes. It opens it up to summary execution. Now that they've declared the United States as a battlefield in the war on terror under the NDAA, now they've been designated as terrorists, they can use terrorist tactics against them, which is interesting because there are allegations floating around which are not substantiated but are pretty interesting. I was looking into them before the show, that some of the main players involved in directing the BLM siege against Bundy, the people on the front lines, were in fact around 10 to 12 years ago special forces Green Beret soldiers who were involved in occupying cities in Pakistan and Afghanistan, fighting Taliban and Al-Qaeda terrorists.
Yeah.
And this was in a Discovery Channel documentary. It appears as if one of the individuals now in charge at the BLM played that role as a special forces Green Beret 12 years ago. He fought terrorists, and now he's on the front line of this siege against Americans who are now being designated by terrorists, not only by Harry Reid. Remember, in that video that came out last night, he said, I've spoken to Eric Holder, I've spoken to the Justice Department, they agree. So it's not just Harry Reid, it's Washington, D.C. that now sees Bundy supporters as terrorists, and it's open game on what's going to happen next.
Yeah, it was interesting. The guy who was there from the BLM, I believe his name was Dan Love, he actually had a sign on him that said police, but he didn't have the sign underneath it had fallen off that said state. And, when we were talking, actually, I got footage of Ammon, one of the sons of Cliven Bundy, and when he got finished and the sheriff was up there, he said to the sheriff, he said, we will listen to you. You have authority here. And he looked at that guy and he said, you have no authority here. And he doesn't. He's just a hired mercenary from the BLM. This goes back to what you've been pointing out, and InfoWars has been pointing out for a long time, Paul. When you were talking about the billions of bullets and you were linking to the documents, and we were talking about how the Department of Education is even creating SWAT teams, the Weather Service is creating SWAT teams. the increasing police state that we see at every bureaucracy. And of course, they write their own laws. They judge whether or not you're in violation of their own laws. You don't have a presumption of innocence. And then they send their militarized police force against you. You've been writing about this, and people have been pushing back about that for a long time.
We've been writing about it for the best part of a decade because, of course, the Defense Department sold all those armored vehicles that they'd used in Afghanistan to local police departments, which were bought with Homeland Security grants. Yes. So everything that they used against terrorists in Afghanistan, they're now using against the American people. Another aspect to it, you mentioned the police state, is the rampant hypocrisy on behalf of the left of either ignoring or enthusiastically supporting state brutality when it's meted out against Americans who may hold differing views to themselves. Because if you followed the conversation on this, obviously with the leftist media, Media Matters, Slate, websites such as those, they're dead set against Bundy. They're classifying everyone as right-wing extremists, and it's being picked up by their acolytes to the point where I'm having conversations with people on Twitter who are calling for Bundy supporters to be, quote, shot on the spot. Mm-hmm. They're calling for belligerent protesters to be executed with drone strikes. So it's just galling how, for example, we saw with Occupy Wall Street, the protesters getting pepper sprayed in the face directly. I mean, we rose up to their defense. Occupy Wall Street protesters targeted by snipers, or
yes.
there was at least a plan to do that.
Yes.
And the left is outraged, and rightly so. Yes. But when it happens to people who may be a little different in their political views, they support state brutality. So that's a major problem. The statists simply do not see that the tyranny is being imposed on everyone. And if they stand on the opposite side to us, then, you know, if we don't hang together, then we hang separate.
The inability to extrapolate it to the larger principles and the blindness that comes from being manipulated by their individual prejudices against these other groups. And I've seen every label that you could put on the Bundy family or the protesters. I've seen those labels put on as a way of building hate. And one of the key organizations at the center of that is the Southern Poverty Law Center. This is an organization that has a mail-order business model that sends out letters and findings to the federal government to essentially set up and create hate for individual groups. That's what they're all about.
It's a hate industry, and
yes.
They get huge grants from governments to continue their existence. They need to continue to escalate the so-called threat posed by hate crime and violent right-wing extremists, which does exist, but certainly nowhere near to the level that they amp it up to. And you can see with their supporters that they were actually excited at the prospect of Bundy supporters getting gunned down, some of them. And they were crushingly disappointed when it didn't happen. So the hypocrisy, again, is rampant. And another angle was this idea of Bundy is sponging off the state. He's engaging in complete lawlessness. A ton of leftists took that stance. And yet they support millions of illegal immigrants who do exactly the same thing. So again, they don't have any actual principles. They just selectively apply them based on whether they agree with you politically or not.
One of the things that bothered me in this entire narrative was the confusion about property rights. What was property? Now, a lot of people have a very simple understanding of property rights to just be, let's say, you own everything in this little squared off area. But here in Texas, a lot of times when you buy a house, you don't get the mineral rights. Those don't convey. And what the Bundys had were surface rights. They had grazing rights. They had water rights. They never claimed to own the land. Now, they did say that they believed that that land should rightfully, under the Constitution, have been ceded to the state authority at the time it became a state. And he was talking about how, as we've seen with Stockman, they did not have the legal authority to be there as a police force. But we need to understand that these property rights have been well established with previous court cases. As a matter of fact, it was just last year. Another case that started back in 1993. Kit Daniels wrote about this yesterday. And a federal judge, in making that decision it was either June or July, said that the BLM had engaged in a criminal conspiracy against ranchers. Now, this all began in 1993. They tried to deny his grazing rights, his water rights, exactly the same things that were going on here in this particular place. And, if you've got property rights on your home and the federal government, and you're paying taxes to the county, and the federal government comes in at some point in time and says, you don't have those rights anymore, we're just going to take them, which is what they did with these ranchers, you're going to be facing exactly the same thing. People need to broaden their perspectives. We've got to go to break. We're going to be right back with Paul Joseph Watson. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and I have Paul Joseph Watson from InfoWars in England on the phone. We've been talking about the stories that he broke yesterday about Harry Reid calling people who are leading a peaceful protest against the police state tactics and brutality that have been going on at the Nevada Ranch for quite some time. He called those peaceful protesters domestic terrorists, and he repeated that for emphasis. And we've just been talking about how the media is joining in on that narrative. We got Reuters talking about these poor federal agents who are set upon by an angry armed mob. That is not what happened. We have footage there. You can see what people are doing, even as they're calmly walking up to the gate. It has been spun by Glenn Beck to say, well, those people at the gate, they were trying to start an incident. They were going to get everybody shot. That wasn't happening. We showed you the video. We were there. I was there. Josh Owens was there. We took the video. We've put it up. It should put the critics to rest, but now they're escalating this. Now Harry Reid has picked up on Glenn Beck's narrative, and now we've got a Homeland Security advisor, Lisa Monaco. This is another story Paul wrote about, saying that any children with confrontational behavior might become terrorists. Now, Paul, they just handed me an article that showed it was a quote, it was a very favorable article about her in the Boston Globe, and they said, unmarried and without children, Monaco is incredibly dedicated to her work, according to those who know her. Well, they may know her, but she doesn't know anything about children, does she?
Well, exactly. And again, you played the Melissa Harris Perry thing just before I came on. It's about this idea that the community should watch and be suspicious of everybody's children and that the parents have no right. So it's a dual-purpose propaganda tactic. They say they lament the fact that government can't watch everybody's children all the time, so now the onus is on the parents to do so. And then you see laws being passed in places like Scotland where state minders are assigned to children from birth to watch for any signs of abuse. Again, it's cradle to grave tyranny, and now they're tying it into the terrorism angle as the war on terror turns inward against the American people. The real problem they've got is the threat of a good example. That's what people like Harry Reid are scared about, because they're worried about the strength in numbers that Americans, that the liberty movement can bring to situations like the Bundy siege. You heard one of the BLM agents say, you know, you're going to have to bring 10,000 people. Well, they didn't even need 10,000 people. They probably had about 1,000, and that made the BLM back down.
Well,
so
I'll tell you what, Paul, it must have scared them to death to see the Bundy family, because that's, you know, he's not a rich rancher, but he is rich with his family. And he's got, I think, 14 children, 40-some-odd grandchildren. They were all very calm, very steady, and very resolute about their freedom and about your freedom. At the very beginning of this, Cliven Bundy said, this is not about the grazing fees. It's not about anything but unchecked power and about your liberty. And that's exactly what it was about. And all of this family that I met, all of them that I saw there, were very calm, very resolute, but they were not going to be backed down.
And the only people goading violence, again, amidst all these smears, are people like Harry Reid. He's the person escalating violence. I mean, Rand Paul went on Fox News last night and said, calmer heads need to prevail, which is exactly what the Bundy supporters did during that standoff. So the only violent rhetoric is coming from their side. And again, they're concerned about the fact that what they would call flash mobs, what we would call activists, were able to dispatch them on such short notice and now actually win crucial battles in the ideological war for the liberty movement. That concerns them greatly. And now we've got economists predicting that 2014, 2015, we're going to see increasing civil unrest in America. And they're concerned about a form of the American spring that's rising in the United States. So that's why they're trying to send a message that this will not be tolerated by labeling anyone that engages in it as domestic terror.
We got to go to break. Can you hang on and do the next segment with us, a short 5-minute segment?
Sure.
All right, we're going to be right back. The info war right now is about seizing the initiative and not letting them divide us into competing groups to understand the broader principles involved. We'll be right back.
Thank you for listening.
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I am David Knight, live here in Austin, and we have live from England, Paul Joseph Watson. And we've been talking about the Bundy Ranch standoff, but there's other things, other flashpoints in the world as well, aren't there, Paul? Cover some of the cover what's going on in the Ukraine, because you've been covering that more closely than I have. I've been so embedded in this story, I haven't really followed the latest updates that are happening there. Go ahead.
Well, of course, pro-Russian Ukrainians have seized government buildings in eastern Ukraine. And basically, we've seen a mass marketing campaign on behalf of the media trying to sell World War III. And there's a thing called Godwin's Law, which is that as soon as you compare something to the Nazis, you lose the argument. Yet we've had Western media accusing pro-Russian protesters in eastern Ukraine of circulating a letter demanding that Ukrainian Jews be registered, obviously a chilling flashback to the Holocaust. It turns out it's completely fake. Jewish advocacy groups have said it's fake. The man whose signature appeared on the alleged letter says that it's completely fake. He never put his signature to the letter. And yet the mass media reported this yesterday as if it was gospel fact. There have been no retractions whatsoever. So they tried to portray the pro-Russian demonstrators as neo-Nazis, when in fact it was the Kiev puppet government that was installed with US help and with the aid of armed militant neo-Nazis. So completely ludicrous. They've launched another false flag hoax. It's been decimated once again. And you go back to the hypocrisy. You know, protesters occupying government buildings in Kiev is a good thing, but protesters occupying government buildings in eastern Ukraine is a bad thing.
Or protesters confronting BLM agents who are occupying land is a bad thing, right? So it's
exactly.
It's wherever they want to go.
Very selective, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah.
But again, you know, using force against protesters in Kiev, that's a bad thing. But using force against protesters in eastern Ukraine is a good thing. And, you know, the US nearly bombed Syria because the Assad government was using tanks, fighter jets and artillery against civilians. But that's exactly what Ukraine started to do this week, and they killed numerous protesters in the process. But again, the media said it was a sober, necessary act. So rampant hypocrisy once again. And it annoys me that whenever I read BBC or CNN, they constantly invoke, quote, Russian propaganda, as if Russia is the only country in the world that engages in propaganda. You know, the official US ban on domestic propaganda, they ended that in June of last year. They openly said we're going to propagandize to our own citizens. So why do we never hear about American propaganda or NATO propaganda? You know, the mainstream media, do they want to insult the intelligence of their viewers to such a degree by pretending that only the Russians do propaganda?
Oh, we've heard a lot of propaganda this week, haven't we, Paul? And that's what we've just been talking about, is how they've been propagandizing and trying to spin this narrative and spin what happened. I think it's very important what Alex Jones said earlier. He said, when they try something, we're going to be there. And we can't always be there with InfoWars. We were this time. But there are going to be people who are going to be there with their cameras, with their iPhones, and they're going to be streaming stuff up no matter what they try. And we have seen this over and over again. And that's one of the things I think was motivating people, was to see this mindless propaganda, to see the police state and the brutality that's happening typically in the cities, typically against minorities, and nothing happening about it. And that's essentially, people have to understand that's the broader principle, don't they, Paul?
Exactly. And people need to understand that we can win. I mean, before the Bundy standoff, everybody was predicting, oh, what's the point? The BLM are just going to do what they want to do anyway. Well, no, they lost and we won. A major turning point in the liberty movement. And again, as he said, you know, when injustice becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. We saw that last weekend. The feds are scared about it. They're scared of these, quote, flash mobs that can activate and organize within 24 hours, basically. And it's a major threat to them.
Paul Joseph Watson from England, thank you for joining us. Thank you for breaking down the recent developments in the Ukraine. We're going to be back with more news, and we're going to take your calls. 800-259-9231. 800-259-9231.
The globalist.
Back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight. We were just talking to Paul Joseph Watson about what's going on in the Ukraine. We're going to be covering some other news here as well. But before we move on from the Nevada Ranch stand down, because there's a lot of pushback here about who the aggressors are, who the terrorists are, who's breaking the law. This is a discussion we need to have. It's about much broader principles, much broader issues. We cannot allow them to divide us down by demographic sectors, pitting one group against another, whether it's about religion or about race or about economic status or about the city versus the country, whatever. We've got to break down that kind of manipulation from the government and from the media, and we need to understand what the broader principles are that are involved here. Now, one person who really does understand that, that's been talking out about that a lot, is Andrew Napolitano, Judge Napolitano. And he had this to say on Fox News. Play this clip.
We've seen some heavy-handed tactics, in fact, in terms of these raids, and then we've seen it, at a more broad level in terms of the IRS, the DOJ going after reporters, the NSA spying on us. I mean, it's
starting to get the idea,
big government
Megan?
Run amok in the eyes of many.
It is the federal government thinking it is immune from the laws of the land, the laws of civility that govern the rest of us, even basic constitutional principles. There's a vast disconnect, not only between the federal government and people like Mr. Bundy. Remember, the government is the servant, not the master. That's in the Constitution of the Declaration of Independence. That's not a political statement. That's a value judgment in the American system.
That's right. That's exactly it.
Look,
he nailed it exactly. And let me read you some of the statements that were made by a federal judge in Nevada last summer. And this is a case that's been going on very similar to Mr. Bundy's case. It's been going on, started in 1993, just like Mr. Bundy's case. And these are some of the things that he added. Now, this is a case with this is Judge Robert C. Jones, and it was the Hagee case, or Hagee case. It's H-A-G-E. I'm not sure exactly how they pronounce that. But he said this. He said, in the present case, the government's actions over the past 2 decades shock the conscience of the court. He said the government may not abuse its discretion in refusing to renew or in revoking a grazing privilege. This is a federal judge speaking last summer. He went on to say, the government has abused its discretion in the present case through a series of actions designed to strip the estate, the Hagee estate, because this fellow had died, of its grazing permits and ultimately to strip defendants of their ability to use their water rights. So you understand that what he's talking about is a government that is out of control, a government that is stripping people of their property rights when it is not in their authority to do so. Their grazing rights, their water rights, that is what they were talking about. The Bundy family never said they owned the land. That's one of the simplest lies to dispel here. And as I mentioned before, in many places you'll buy property for your home and the mineral rights will not convey. And of course, there was a big fight about the mineral rights. We have pointed this out. We broke the story last Friday, that Harry Reid was very much involved in surface rights and solar rights and mineral rights. And there's been research around there to get gold and platinum as well as oil, but it was the mitigation rights so that they could go forward with these solar projects. It was sweetheart deals for the Chinese energy company, ENN. Harry Reid was involved in that. It was Harry Reid and his son who brokered a deal for that same Chinese energy company, and this is a done deal. Gave them 9,000 acres. Now, if you don't live in the country, you can't even imagine how big 9,000 acres is. Sold it to them for 10 cents on the dollar. 10 cents on the dollar. At the same time, they're telling the Bundy family and all the rest of the ranchers, there were like 53 ranchers there, everyone's been driven out by these tactics. They reduced the size of their business by 90%. If you have a business, could you keep your business going if somebody just came in and by fiat, cut it down to 90% tomorrow? If you're living off of a wage as a worker, what if somebody were to cut your salary by 90% tomorrow? What would that do to you? Well, it's put everybody out of business. Cliven Bundy hung on. He was the only one who was able to hang on. But that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about broad things. We're talking about property rights in general. We're talking about civil liberties in general. We're talking about corrupt politicians who are doing insider trading using their sons, and he has several sons that are involved in this lobbyist group. It's not just Rory. He's even got a son-in-law. I think it's like 3 other sons besides him and a son-in-law involved in this law firm in Nevada that's doing sweetheart deals, and not just with the Chinese corporate capitalists. They're also doing it with other giant corporations, and they've already broke ground on another solar project, First Solar. But there's solar projects all over that area, and they all want to use the Bundy Ranch as a kind of carbon tax credit, as a solar mitigation area. And they're using the same tactic that they always do: environmental species, water rights, and climate change. In this case, it's an endangered species that they're coming after, the desert tortoise. This is Agenda 21. And you know, if Glenn Beck had read the book that he supposedly wrote, he would have seen this as Agenda 21 from the very beginning. He would have understood that this is the motivation behind what is happening. Moving people off of the land, moving people off of the farms or ranches of the rural areas, moving people out of the suburban areas and into 200-square-foot homes in the city. We're talking about them cutting down the allotment of the Bundy family and the other ranchers down there by 90%. They want to cut down the size of your home by 90%. You're living in a 2,000-square-foot home, for example. They want everybody in a 200-square-foot home. And I would say it's a 90% reduction. Most people, if they got a single-family home, it's probably 1,500 to 2,000 square feet. They want you living in something that is a tenth that size. That's where this is headed. That's what everybody needs to understand. I'll read you one more thing from Judge Jones. And he wrote that the government did not bring criminal misdemeanor trespass claims against this rancher, Hagee. This is a decision from last summer. It's a different case, but in the same area, same issues involved. They also came after him about trespassing. He said they didn't claim that he was criminally trespassing because the federal government believed that it could not satisfy the burden of proof in a criminal trespass action, as a previous criminal action against this rancher, E. Wayne Hagee, had been reversed in the Court of Appeals. Do you understand that? All this stuff about trespass cattle, all this stuff about who owns the land. It's not about who owns the land. It's about who owns the rights, the grazing rights, the water rights that were established there. It's also about saying that they did not have criminal trespass rights. They had lost that when they tried it against another rancher. So what did they do? They sent down, and let's get that clip from Rand Paul. They sent down an army of BLM agents who were pointing rifles at people all week, attacking people all week. And when protesters went down there to get the cattle that they had stolen, they were threatening to shoot the protesters. Let's play this comment from Rand Paul. He's talking about Harry Reid calling the peaceful protesters against the police state domestic terrorists.
And this is a real, I think, intellectual and constitutional and legal debate, but it shouldn't be about violence of arms, and I hope that the government will not be there in full arms and provoke a showdown and something terrible will happen. I hope that doesn't happen.
Well, isn't that what the stage is being set for? And maybe because of what Senator Reid had just said, he not only called the Bundy family domestic terrorists, the supporters, the people who believe in whatever's going on out there, if they're on the Bundy side, they're domestic terrorists as well. Doesn't that sound like he's setting it up for maybe some more military action, maybe bringing some feds in there, maybe having this escalate?
Yeah, I don't know what will happen. All I know is, from my perspective, I have a legal solution to this. I have a bill that I introduced last year, and I believe the senator from Nevada, Senator Heller, is a sponsor of this bill. This would give states more control over the land and more control over the Endangered Species Act. I would like to see the governor of Nevada and the state legislature of Nevada be in charge of trying to help preserve species, but also aware of cattlemen and ranchers' needs. Nobody in Washington really knows anything about ranching or grazing of cattle or the long history that's gone on with this. We need to take this out of the hands of Washington, but let's have a rational debate without violence, without incitement on either side. But I have a bill that would actually fix this problem. It's been in the hopper for over a year. We should ask Senator Reid if he'll let me have a vote on it.
Absolutely. He understands the issue. He understands that we have out-of-control bureaucracies. There is nobody ever been on any ballot that I've seen from the Bureau of Land Management. I don't get a chance to vote for them, and yet they're writing laws. They're creating taxes. They're sending armies against us. We have swarms of officers who are eating out our people's substance. They have become abusive of our rights. And we have not only a right, but a duty to alter or abolish governments like that. We have out-of-control alphabet agencies. Rand Paul has talked about this before. I hope that bill goes through. And that is something that's in the Constitution. That's another legal argument that we need to have. The Enclave Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, says that the federal government will only have 10 square miles of the country, and that's for the District of Columbia, and whatever they need as forts and as arsenals, things like that. Clearly never designed to own millions of acres of land and do what they're doing with it, which is basically using it as their private fiefdoms, trading it off to giant corporations, to foreign governments, so that they can make money under the table. Now, let me read you one more thing, because there was a no-fly zone put over this area. Unprecedented that they would put something up like that, and unprecedented that they would let it last for 30 days. Now, I haven't seen whether or not this has been taken down since everything happened last week. Of course, Harry Reid says it's not over, so maybe that is still standing. But that's typically the type of thing they do when the president is visiting an area. I want to read you this story that was from an interview with Der Spiegel online. And this is from a drone operator who admits that he was ordered to kill countless innocent citizens, including children. He says after 6 years in the Air Force, he's starting to open up about the psychological toll that it's taken on him. He says, this is Brandon Bryant, 27, from Missoula, Montana, who killed scores of innocents, and we're going to be right back. I want you to read what he said about that. You're going to want to hear this, especially if you're in the military or law enforcement. Follow your oaths. There are higher laws.
How can you save a ton of money and prepare for a...
Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and we've been talking about the breaking news. Now, of course, Paul Joseph Watson, who was on the show earlier, was talking about the White House counterterror chief saying that confrontational children could be terrorists. Now, at the same time, we just had a story yesterday atop a Drudge showing that Hillary Clinton says that she's going to be a grandmother. You know, I didn't even know that Monica Lewinsky was pregnant. But I guess she's going to be a grandmother, and she can play that loving role just in time for the 2016. Her child will be this adorable 2-year-old about that time, and her grandchild. And so that'll be a nice little diversion for people to get people to vote for her, because, you know, it's all about identity. It doesn't really matter about issues anymore, or does it? I think it does. That's the discussion we're going to have. What was happening here? What was really at issue? And, of course, the other big story that we've been covering is Harry Reid talking about characterizing the people that were at the peaceful protest against the police state there at the Bundy Ranch, calling them domestic terrorists. Let's hear it straight from the turtle's mouth. Go ahead, play it.
Keep in mind what happened up there. There were hundreds of people from around the country that came there. They had sniper rifles on the freeway.
Yeah.
They had assault weapons.
That was the government, wasn't it, Harry?
And as one of the former sheriffs from Arizona said, and we had children and women lined up because if anybody got hurt, we wanted to make sure they got hurt first, because we wanted the federal government hurting women and children. This is the deal, and it's not a good one. So these people who hold themselves out to be patriots are not. They're nothing more than domestic terrorists. And I think that we are a country that people should follow the law. And what went up in Mesquite is not very good. I repeat, what went on up there is domestic terrorism. Okay, domestic terrorism, not tourism.
There we go. That's Harry Reid saying that what happened there was domestic terrorism, putting the lie out that women and children were being put up front. There were no children put up front. There were women that were walking amongst the crowd. The crowd had been there for quite some time, being threatened by the government to be shot the entire time. Nobody was threatening the government. I've seen pictures of one guy up on the overpass that had a gun. There were SWAT teams down there, not only pointing guns at people who were unarmed down below, but threatening to shoot if they did not leave the area. But they would not leave the area. It was either get the cattle or be the cattle. That was really the issue that was there. But if he's going to characterize these people as domestic terrorists, then what does that imply? Does that imply that they could use drones to shoot the crowd next time? Let's talk to let's take a look at what a former drone operator is saying. And I was talking about this in the last segment. This is a guy who was a drone operator. This is an interview that's from Spiegel Online. Brandon Bryant, 27, from Missoula, Montana, said that he killed scores of innocents. That's what he said. He could not take orders anymore after following orders to shoot and kill a child in Afghanistan. You want to talk about really what's going on with children, Harry? Let's talk about this policy that you and Obama and many Republicans support. He knew that following the orders was wrong, but the very fact that he had been ordered to murder people who it was clear to him were innocent, it told him that he was fighting for some very bad people. He said, the very first time I fired a drone missile, He said, I killed 2 men instantly and cried all the way home. I felt disconnected from humanity for almost a week. I saw men, women, and children die. These moments are now like in slow motion. He said at one point he saw a flash on the screen. This is straight out of the movie that was entered into the Paul Revere contest, American Drone by Johan Dutoit. If I'm saying his name correctly, I apologize, Johan, if I didn't get it. Dutoit, exactly out of the movie. He sees a flash on the screen, an explosion, a building collapsing on a child right next to it. And he said he had a sick feeling in his stomach. And just like in the movie, he said, did we just kill a kid? He asked the drone operator next to him. And the other drone operator coldly said, yeah, I guess that was a kid. Now he says he can't just switch and go back to a normal life. See, there really are bad guys who really are shooting children, and they are people who are pushing the buttons and executing the policies, remote control from Washington. And it won't be that long before they start doing that to people in the U.S. They had drones out there, some people reported. They definitely had a helicopter there. They definitely had a fixed-wing plane that was circling the area. They had set the area up as a no-fly zone. Those aerial pictures that you see of the shooter on the bridge, he was such a threat to them, they would have taken him out instantly. He was a sitting duck. They were the only ones who had air support. We're going to be right back. We're going to take your calls, and we're going to talk about something that happened in Iran with a bank and a plane from America. Reported by the New York Times, so I guess we can believe it. Actually, I do believe it. We're going to be right back with that story, so stay tuned.
We're on the march.
Right, you heard President Eisenhower and his famous military. You just heard President Eisenhower in his famous military-industrial complex speech, and he was talking about the potential for misplaced power to arise, and that's exactly what happened. Now, you also heard in that clip someone talking about, Homeland Security's on a buying spree, and they are on a buying spree. And, of course, it's hollow point bullets, ammunition that is banned by the Geneva Convention for use from one army to another. But, of course, they can use those hollow point bullets against us. But, there's another buying spree that's going on. I said we're going to cover some information about some developments in Iran with bankers. Listen to this. This was an article that went up today on InfoWars, and it's from Washington's blog. Bankers are behind the wars. Now, they quote on this Nomi Prinz, and to give you an idea of her qualifications, we just had her on the show yesterday. Alex Jones interviewed her yesterday. She is a former managing director of Goldman Sachs. She was the head of international analytics at Bear Stearns in London. She knows the history of banking. She understands what's going on. And she says that she's done a lot of research. She says, throughout the century that I examined, which began with the panic of 1907, the banking panic of 1907, she said what she found in looking at the archives of each president is that through many events and periods, particular banks were in constant contact with the White House, and not just about financial and economic issues, she said, but also about aspects of World War I or World War II or the Cold War. She points out that Morgan Bank funded 75% of the financing for the Allied forces during World War I, and of course was very heavily involved in Wilson, who pushed us into that war. She talks about World War II, when Eisenhower became president in the Cold War. She says what bankers did then was they opened up hubs in areas like Cuba, in areas like Beirut and Lebanon, where the U.S. also wanted to gain a stronghold in their Cold War fight against the Soviet Union. And so the juxtaposition of finance and foreign policy were very much aligned. And then she also points out about the Bush family and their connections in World War II. The Guardians obtained confirmation from a newly discovered files in the U.S. National Archives that a firm of which Prescott Bush was director was involved in the with financial architects of Nazism. Of course, that's Brown Brothers Harriman, the father of George H.W. Bush, the father of George II, and the great-grandfather of George II, and the great-grandfather of George III, George P. Bush, who's now running for office here in Texas. So we see that happened. We also know that German bankers set up Lenin and the Communist Revolution. So I thought it was very interesting. Read this history. It's a very long article up on InfoWars. It's from Washington's blog. Bankers are behind the war, behind the wars. So I saw this story from the New York Times that came out yesterday, and it says, Iran gets an unlikely visitor, an American plane, but no one seems to know why. Now, this is witnessed by a New York Times reporter who was in the capital of Iran, Tehran. On Tuesday morning, Iran had an unlikely visitor, a plane owned by the Bank of Utah, a community bank in Ogden that has 13 branches throughout the state. Bearing a small American flag on its tail, the aircraft was parked in a highly visible section of the airport in Tehran. Now, this is the New York Times. You can believe them. A lot of people would discount it. Snopes would discount it if we reported this, but this is the New York Times, and I do believe this. Frankly, I do believe it. And a lot of the people who would normally push back on this, they probably won't, hopefully. Now, listen to some of the other things that are interesting about this. That plane is held in a trust by a bank in Utah. One of the executives at the bank said, we have no idea why the plane was at the airport. Now, the New York Times asked the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, who is enforcing sanctions against Iran, what was an American plane doing there, a plane that belongs to an American bank? They declined comment. They then asked the Iranian officials. They also declined comment. Because you see, if an American plane is going to go to Iran when it's under sanctions, it would have to have prior approval from the U.S. government. Now, it gets very interesting because they follow this trail. They can't get anybody to say what it's doing there, but we know what has historically happened. We know that bankers are behind the wars. It's just one more evidence of that, and it brings up a question as to what's going to change now in Iran. Who knows? But we also know what's going on here in America. We know that there is graft and corruption that is behind this Agenda 21 type movement that we see developing in Nevada. We see that it's being spun by people as they were trespassers. They didn't own the property. They never said they owned the property. They owned grazing rights. They owned water rights. They were not trespassing. We just had a court decision from another federal judge last summer, similar case with a rancher, similar rights. They tried to get him on trespass charges. It was thrown out by a federal appeals court. This federal judge last summer said he was ashamed of the federal courts, of the federal actions that the bureaucracies took. It's exactly what is happening here. People need to understand that property rights are fundamental to our civil rights, and they're able to divide people based on left and right alliances who don't really understand that. But I wanted to play where this is really headed. Now it's escalated even more. The beginning of the week, you just had some of the media, led by Glenn Beck, trying to hang the label of sovereign citizen on the Bundy family. And that was never what he was saying. Glenn Beck and the people that work for him know very well, or at least they certainly should know by now, that when you call somebody a sovereign citizen, if you ask somebody, as they did, are you a member of the sovereign citizen movement? Because that's what I hear you saying. When they do that, they are labeling him as a domestic terrorist. And Harry Reid has picked up that narrative. Listen to what he said yesterday.
So these people who hold themselves out to be patriots are not. They're nothing more than domestic terrorists. And I think that we are a country that people should follow the law. And what went up in Mesquite is not very good. I repeat, what went on up there is domestic tourism. Okay, domestic terrorism, not tourism.
Yeah, he repeated that a couple of times just to make sure that you get that. Just like Glenn Beck early in the week kept repeating the sovereign citizen label. You hang that on somebody, they have been training for years with law enforcement that anybody they label as a sovereign citizen is someone who is an immediate threat to law enforcement. That's what was the dangerous game that he was playing earlier this week, Glenn Beck. Now we see Harry Reid picking up the narrative and calling everybody there domestic terrorists. Let's take some of your calls here. We got Paul in New Jersey. You wanted to talk about the attack on farms. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, we've been taken over a long time ago, 100-year anniversary last year of the banker takeover.
That's right. That's right.
And we are essentially communists and don't know it.
Yep. Yeah, I agree.
The income tax, you got, it's unbelievable. But
Paul, are you a farmer?
Huh?
Are you a farmer, Paul?
No, I'm a farmer in the city.
Okay.
But
farmer in spirit. Good.
Yeah, well, but see, what happened is the income tax is actually unlawful, according to, anybody with an occupation, doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, are not liable for that tax. But they entrap you. Once you sign that 1040 form on the penalty of perjury, you are accepting the tax. Yeah,
we had an interesting story here that I led off with at the beginning of the first hour where Donald Rumsfeld said this week, the day before everybody filed their returns on the 15th, he said on the 14th, he said, every year I send my taxes to the IRS and I enclose a letter saying I have no idea whether or not this is true or not. So evidently he signs because they would come back and make it. Maybe they don't make Donald Rumsfeld sign his tax forms because, you know, most of these guys, they don't pay taxes either. But he said that they're known unknowns, that he doesn't really know. It's too complicated. He can't decide about that. This is a guy who's supposed to be pretty smart. He was Secretary of Defense twice. He's both the youngest and the oldest Secretary of Defense we had, and yet he says he can't understand what's going on with that. But we see the federal government coming after people who don't want to be compelled to make a signed confession of anything because we have constitutional protections against that. But that doesn't stop them, does it, Paul?
Another thing is you got to get a film called Freedom to Fascism. That'll tell you all about the income tax.
Yeah.
It's unlawful, but they entrap you with the UCC.
Yeah, we had a case just this last November where a lady did not want to sign her income tax return. The IRS filled it out, and actually the number that they came up with was 0. And but she still refused to say it. They took her to court, and they had the judge actually tell the jury they were going to hold her in contempt. They said the judge told them, it doesn't matter if what I'm telling you is unlawful. It doesn't matter if what I'm telling you is unconstitutional. Do it or you're going to be in contempt. Well, this is the way we roll it back. We heard earlier that Judge Andrew Napolitano said, the people are not the servants, the people are the masters. Well, how do we do that? We have to get mastery of the law. That's how we have to do that. Well, how do we get mastery of the law if we've got bureaucracies in Washington that are never elected? So you can't unelect them. They're unaccountable. They persist between Republican administrations going to Democrat administrations and on and on and on. They're there forever. They're writing their own laws. They're writing their own regulations, which have the force of law. They're now up to like 28,000 pages. A few years ago, a guy wrote an article in one of the publications, the 10,000 commandments. It's way beyond that now. It's approaching 30,000 commandments from the government. How do we get these people under control? I think one of the key things that we have to do, because we cannot count on some hero, Captain America, to get elected president. We can't even count on that at the federal level. We have to exercise the division of power that we have as the people in juries. We have to demand, we have to request jury trials, and we have to stand for each other, just as people stood for Cliven Bundy at the ranch about his property, stood with him about his rights. We have to stand for each other. We have to not be intimidated by these judges who are illegally instructing people that they are not to judge the law, but only the facts as presented to them. You were there as a juror to judge and to see that justice is done. And if that means that you're going to strike down and ignore an unconstitutional law or a penalty that you think is draconian, you have an obligation to do it. And that's exactly what happened in that tax trial. And they had one juror, that's all it takes, 1 out of 12, about 8%, to stand up to that and say no. That's what we have to do. There was a very few number of people relatively that were there at the Bundy Ranch. And of the people that were there, most of them were up on the overpass. They weren't down at the bottom. But a few people, if they're determined to stand up for the right thing, can do it. Thank you, Paul. Let's go to Billy in California. Billy, you got something to say about the Bundy situation?
Hey, how you doing, David Knight? I wanted to talk about, on Monday, you had said something about how when the rhetoric was coming out from the mainstream media, like, don't go out there, you know, you guys are going to cause a revolutionary war, you're going to cause a civil war, you're going to cause shooting and violence. You had brought up a point that says, don't listen to that because that's just a bunch of rhetoric to make people, to give us like a chilling effect.
Yes.
And it clicked when you said that. That reminds me of the whole Snowden thing. Was the whole Snowden thing a big false flag just to give us a chilling effect so the government can tell us now openly, we know what you're doing, we're following you, we're doing facial scans, we're doing all these, we're looking at your emails. I mean, it seems like it was a big false flag.
Well, you know, you always have to worry about things like that. And, you know, we had these reports that were coming out from Homeland Security saying, they're just going to stand down and give you guys the cattle because they just want to get everybody's cell phone numbers. They want to get everybody's pictures in the database. And it's like, come on, they're already doing that. We already know that they're doing that. If that's the lesson we're going to take from the Snowden leaks, that we need to stand down because they're watching us, we've lost. we've lost our backbone. We've lost our dignity as human beings. We have to stand up. That's when they say that they're looking at what we're doing and they say they're monitoring us. They say they're putting us on lists. That's all the more reason to get in their faces. We have to take this back. We cannot be intimidated about this. Whatever their motivations were, certainly the government wants us to know that they are watching us. That's a large part of what's going on with all of this. They want to intimidate people. They're always doing predictive programming. They do it through the movies. They do it through press releases. They can do it through leaks. Many people have said that they believe that that's what's behind this. May very well be. The question is, what are we going to do with the information? A lot of people will criticize InfoWars for exposing what their plans are, what they're doing. We have to wake people up to see what's going on. And if their lesson is that they're going to back down and not doing anything, that's not acceptable. We have to stand up. And that's the thing about the Bundy Ranch that got me excited, was that people finally stood up and took to take back their rights. Thank you, Billy in California. Let's go to Cody in Utah. Cody?
Hi, David.
Hi.
First-time caller here. I wanted to congratulate you on the coverage that we got to see at the Bundy Ranch.
Oh. No, don't congratulate me. Listen, we've got to go to a break. I hear the music coming in. Hang on. I'll pick you up right after the commercial break. Yeah, please, I appreciate the encouragement, but you know what? It was the Bundys that have been fighting this for 20 years. It was the Bundys who had the calm resolve to lead people peacefully to stand up to the police state. They're the ones that we need to thank. I would like to see those guys, any of them. Like the Alex Jones Show, I'm David Knight, and we're taking your calls right here in this segment. I wanted to tell you that this hour of the Alex Jones Show is brought to you by Pro One. And we have a special right now at the Alex Jones at the InfoWars store. The Pro Pure Traveler is 25% off. Today is the last day of that sale. Now, you know, one of the things that I realized standing out there in the sun for the long time that we were there was one of the most vital things for your survival is water. You can't go very long without water. We have a very complicated, very fragile infrastructure. If you're going to make preparations in case something happens to the infrastructure, and you should, one of the key things you need to do is prepare for your water needs to make sure you've got a clean source of water. And even before the infrastructure collapses, and let's hope that it doesn't, it still filters out fluoride. And if you're on well water, it gets rid of glyphosate, because that's something you really need to worry about if you're on well water, because people who are using Roundup, that's the chemical in Roundup, that can seep down and get its way into the water supply system. So today, Pro Pure Traveler, 25% off. This is the last day, and you'll find that at our store. Now, I was just talking to Cody in Utah, and we had to go to a commercial break. Cody, go ahead. Tell the audience what you were thinking.
Well, I was thinking, I've been following the Cliven Bundy story for a little while now, and I had listened to the show on Monday, and then I listened to the Glenn Beck show later that day. And Glenn Beck it's just been really bothering me how he's been, trying to deface us and deface any peaceful movement and call it, saying that we're the violent ones. That, we weren't pointing any guns at anybody. We had guns pointed at us. It's just funny how he can cowardly say that we're the ones that are portraying this deadly revolution. He was asking, what are we going to do, even if we did have a revolution? What would we even do?
I was very surprised at the tack that he took. He had an article early in the week that was 7 points that he went down. Every single one of them sounded like the talking points from Bureau of Land Management press releases that I had gone to. They had teleconferences, and we listened to their stuff, and it was like, this is not what's going on at all. This is just mindless propaganda. He was repeating that stuff and going beyond it. As I mentioned, he hung the label of sovereign citizen on Mr. Bundy, which is not at all what he was saying. He was saying that the local law enforcement is sovereign there, and that's, as Texas Representative Stockman has pointed out, that's what the federal law says, that if they're going to go in and use force anywhere, they need to contract with local law enforcement to get this done. But it wasn't just in that area. It was like, are you seriously defending Harry Reid and saying he's not involved in graft and corruption? Look at the ENN deal for 9,000 acres, where ENN got that for 10 cents on the dollar. That's a done deal. and you can look at all of these solar mitigation plants, the fact that they pointed directly to the Bundy Ranch as essentially their carbon credit for these solar projects. Harry Reid has revived the ENN project in the past when it was faltering. He may do that again. Maybe that's what he was talking about when he said it's not over. Who knows? But he came out and he stepped it up again. Let's play that clip real quick for people, the one where he accuses people of being domestic terrorists.
So these people who hold themselves out to be patriots are not. They're nothing more than domestic terrorists. And I think that we are a country that people should follow the law. And what went up in Mesquite is not very good. I repeat, what went on up there is domestic terrorism. Okay, domestic
there you
terrorism.
Go. There you go. Domestic terrorism. And, of course, that was the narrative that was being sold on Glenn Beck's channel. One of the things that really amazed me was that one of his 7 talking points, one of them was, is this about the turtles? If he had read the book that has his name on it about Agenda 21, he would know that Agenda 21 is part of this. But he didn't present anything fairly in that. Very disappointing. We're going to be right back. We're going to take some more of your calls right after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight on this Friday, April 18th, 2014, and this is Good Friday. We're going to talk in a little bit about what role does God have in this country. I saw something that I want to relay to you, and it's part of this larger story about what was going on. What were people planning? What were people strategizing? We're going to talk about that when we come back in the next segment, but I wanted to keep taking some calls here. I've got Root Boy in New York. You said you wanted to respond to an article?
Yeah, David, hi. Codename Root Boy calling from Delta Bravo sector of central New York. I have 2 questions. Number one, for our liberty renaissance here, we really only have 2 choices for right now, and maybe a third if Jesse gets in. And unfortunately, we have to compete in the matrix of the left-right paradigm, and that's the Republicans. Mm-hmm. You on the floor, the ground floor of the battle last week, in that Fox News interview, Rand Paul played some lip service, at the beginning of the interview, and then he says, let calmer heads prevail. And then his answer in the soundbite was that I have a bill in the hopper. Mm-hmm. And so my question to you, Mr. David Knight, who was there with black uniform contractors, sniper rifles trained on you, I mean, is that enough?
Well, I'll be happy for anything that gets done like that. And Rand Paul has had bills introduced in the past. He had a read it, write it, and something else bill. I can't remember it exactly now. But basically, we're going to make sure that the bills are actually read. We're going to give people enough time to read them before they sign them. And certainly we want to see things happening there. But as I said before, we could elect Captain America to be president, and it isn't going to solve the problem. The bureaucracies are way out of control. And it isn't just the Bureau of Land Management. They're just a good example of it. But we have this being done by the EPA. We've got it being done by Fish and Wildlife. We've got it being done by the IRS. Whatever agency you are involved with. And one of the Bundy brothers was there. He said, hey, I don't have a ranch. I work selling timeshares in Las Vegas. He goes, I've seen government regulations making it impossible for us to do business because we've got to report everything to them. This is the oppression. What is going to get us out of it is I think we can take direct action with jury nullification. Personally, that's where I have the most hope. It's going to have to be done at the state level, but it's more importantly, it's got to be done by the people. We have to get people to understand what the issues are and get upset about the police state, because that's what it ultimately comes down to. Whether it's Harry Reid forcing some poor rancher out of his farm so that he can help these crony capitalists, these global capitalists, whatever his motivation is, whether they're enforcing Agenda 21, whatever, where the rubber meets the road is when they send out these militarized police forces from these bureaucracies. And yes, we're going to have to stand up to them. We're going to have to peacefully protest them and stand up to them. We need to make sure we do not lose the Second Amendment. That is a deterrent. It is a peaceful deterrent, just as we had nuclear weapons as a deterrent against nuclear war during the Cold War. We need to make sure that I don't want to see a nuclear option happening. I don't want to see it break out into that. Nobody wanted to see a nuclear war happen between the U.S. and between Russia. And we don't want to see it happen again now either. But that's what we have to do. And we have to realize that there are certain things that we can do, like jury nullification, very, very powerful. We don't have to beg any elected representatives about that at the state, local, or federal level. We can do it ourselves. Get on a jury. Stand up for your fellow man's justice, for his individual rights. We're going to be right back. We're going to take some more calls. Thank you, Root Boy from New York. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and we're taking your calls here at the show. We're talking about what happened at the Nevada Ranch standoff about a week ago, but I want to cover a couple of different issues here for a moment. We had a caller in the last segment that was saying, what do we do to take this back? Can we elect somebody like Rand Paul? He was concerned that Rand Paul wasn't coming out quickly enough, coming out strongly enough about this. Look, he came back, and I'm happy if he's going to introduce a bill. We need to find people, though, that are going to stand up for what we already have as rights. And I'm not saying that Rand Paul's not doing that, but we have the authority to stand up for these rights. And ultimately, it comes down to us. So what are we going to do about it? Well, of course, one of the things that we can do is jury nullification. As I mentioned before, this is the week that most people filled out their tax forms and sent them in. And we had Donald Rumsfeld saying that he wasn't comfortable signing that form because he didn't really understand the taxes were too complicated. He really didn't understand it. He understood that he was incriminating himself, so he attached a letter. I don't know if that would stand up in the IRS's court or not. And you, of course, do not get a trial unless they're coming after you for something criminal. But they do treat it as criminal, and if you do not sign your tax form in many cases. And as I pointed out, we just had a case last November, and it was a woman, Doreen Hendrickson, and they tried to jail her because she owed no taxes. She owed zero taxes, but she did not want to sign the form that they had filled out. And the amazing court order, and this is what the judge said, she told the jury, that it is not a defense to the crime of contempt that the court order was unlawful or unconstitutional. Think about that. So in other words, that's what we're hearing from so many people who are criticizing what happened at the Bundy Ranch. It's like, hey, that's the government's land, and the government said to do this, and it's like, so just get on your knees and bow down and do whatever they say. You should not think about or challenge the fact that it was unconstitutional or unlawful. Now, we are seeing some victories at the local level, and I think that there's really more that can be done, not only with jury nullification, but also at the state and local level. And we see some movement in the states. For instance, in Vermont, this was just yesterday, the Vermont Senate approved GMO labeling bill and is going to send it back to the House for a final vote. If this goes through in the House of Representatives of Vermont, Vermont would be the first state in the country to require labeling of foods made with genetically modified organisms. And the people there protesting, one of them's got a sign that says, label GMOs, let me decide. See, we can make those decisions ourselves. We don't need a nanny state in Washington. We just need to know what's in the food that we're getting. And of course, the corporatists who are running the government don't want that to happen. They've shut that down in many states, shut it down in California. They have tried to shut it down in Washington. Now Vermont is going out and saying, we have a right to know what is in our food. And then they can make the decision whether or not they want to do it. We also see this. Maryland governor signs a marijuana decriminalization bill. That also happened just a couple of days ago. Now, this is a bill that's going to change some of the things involved in medical marijuana, but it is also going to decriminalize small amounts of marijuana. So the federal government is pushing ahead with their illegal drug wars. They have no authority to prohibit anything, folks. They had to have a constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol. Where is the constitutional amendment to prohibit marijuana? Where is the constitutional amendment to prohibit anything? Where's the constitutional amendment that's going to prohibit drugs for cancer patients who are on death row? And they want to make the decisions about their life, whether or not they take those drugs or not. A lot of people need medical marijuana. It really, really makes me sick to see so many people who should be defending Christians. Many Christians, they are so concerned about marijuana that they will deny it to people who are gravely ill and not allow them to have medical marijuana. How can they shut off that compassion? It's not even legal. We have to get out of this slavish mentality to government. In Tennessee, they just had a bill to nullify federal hemp ban that was just signed by the governor there, I believe. It's gone to that point. It says it's moved forward. This was on April the 10th, and so maybe it has not passed just yet, but is on the docket. Looks like it's going to pass if it hasn't. And here's the thing. It's going on in Michigan as well. Rand Paul has introduced in Kentucky bills that would legalize hemp. Hemp has such a small amount of THC in it, if it's got any at all, that you can't use it as a psychoactive drug. It is simply competition for pharmaceutical companies, for cotton companies and industries. It has so many different uses. And again, out of fear and panic and misinformation, hemp has been outlawed along with marijuana, and they don't have the authority to outlaw anything. That is why we have 2 of the 20-some-odd constitutional amendments in the Constitution, is one to make alcohol illegal and the other one to make it legal again. If they had the ability to just say alcohol is illegal, why did we need to have the constitutional amendment to do that? And we see that people are starting to wake up. Take a look at what's going on with John McCain, one of our favorite politicians here. He has been voted the most unpopular senator in America. Neither Republicans nor Democrats trust him. This is from the Capitalism Institute. They say that he was recently censured by the Arizona GOP for his moderate stance and his constant compromising with Obama. And as examples, they point out, of course, he supported the bombing campaign in Syria, arming their rebels, supports gun control. And, of course, you also see him with the neo-Nazis and the Ukraine. Why does the point man for all of this, for the military-industrial complex, John McCain, why does he always go and get his picture taken with al-Qaeda and with the neo-Nazis? Well, the same reason that the CIA used to work with Noriega before George H.W. Bush started calling him Strongman Noriega and invaded Panama. Look, they can go in and get these gangsters, whether it's a drug-dealing criminal like Noriega or whether it's al-Qaeda or whether it is the neo-Nazis. They can always go in, work with them to overthrow the regime that they want to overthrow. And then because it's so easy to make a case as to how criminal these guys are, they can then easily take them out. It's a perfect mob tactic, and they're doing that over and over again. I'm surprised that these guys on the other side keep falling for that. I mean, but they do use the same MO over and over again, whether it's false flag attacks or whether it's taking some criminal group, making them your ally, using them to overthrow a government, and then turning on that group afterwards. They keep using the same MOs over and over again. One last story before we go back to your calls. Is your home's energy meter spying on you? And this is from Fox News, and this is a story out of... where was this? I'm not seeing the place where this is out, but basically, this is out of California. And what they were concerned about is the privacy and the data. And the irony of this is that as they were protesting this, the utility company there started monitoring the meters and the privacy of the people there who were protesting them, basically fulfilling their concern about it being a privacy invasion. And of course, there's many issues with smart meters. It's not just privacy. Many people have raised health issues. An excellent documentary that we carry that shows the effect of these smart meters pulsing. You can actually see insects on a leaf jerking as the smart meter is pulsing. It sends out a lot of energy. A lot of people have had health problems with it, but you can actually see it with the insects. So that's a very real effect. And the privacy issue is a very real effect. As they're pointing here in the article, they're pointing out information gathered from smart meters includes things like unencrypted data, which other people can grab, right? Details showing when you're away from home, what your typical usage, when you're typically home, when you're away, and then also looking at what kind of activities you're engaged in. Do you have, are you watching television? How long are you spending cooking? But more importantly, they point out that police agencies are using this utility data to determine if suspects are maybe growing marijuana in their homes. So they look at it, and if they see that you've got a lot of electricity usage, they think that maybe you're growing marijuana at home. You might be doing hydroponics. We've had situations where people were growing hydroponics and all of a sudden they get SWAT teamed. And in a situation like that, those people are probably more likely to get killed by a SWAT team if they have access, do something. They think that their home is being invaded. If they were really criminals that were growing marijuana, and I say that lightly, that's the government's definition of a crime. As I mentioned, I don't believe that's a crime, should not be a crime. But those people who are doing something that has been declared illegal by the government, they may be expecting a SWAT team's raid. So when somebody kicks in the door, they keep it cool. But if somebody is minding their own business, not doing anything that they believe that the government should be concerned about, and what the government is concerned about is their electricity usage. We had a case just a couple of weeks ago where the police were watching hydroponic stores and followed this woman home, surveilled her, SWAT teamed her. This has happened many, many times. It just happened a couple of weeks ago again, but I heard these stories 20 years ago. This has been going on for a very long time. How do we rein in this criminal government? Let's go to your calls. John in Texas, you had something you wanted to say about Harry Reid. Go ahead.
Hello, David.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I was listening to Greg Palast on a radio show last night, and he just dropped a little diamond for us. Apparently, you may already know this, of course, but Harry Reid was instrumental in acquiring the rights to a gold mine for a Canadian corporation called Barrick.
Yes.
They paid a little under $10,000 to the U.S. Treasury for this gold mine, which had an estimated value of $10 billion in gold ore.
Well, yeah,
so,
amazing, yeah. Hang on, we'll come right back to you. That's what we see happening. As I mentioned, he did the deal with ENN, gave them the stuff for 10 cents on the dollar. You're talking about Barrick. The guy who was very much involved with Barrick, very high in their company, is the father of Harry Reid's chief staffer, who is now the director of the BLM. We'll be right back with your calls. Hang on. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and we've been taking your calls. We have a call coming up that you're not going to want to miss. It's Cliven Bundy. We're establishing contact with him right now. And I want to get his response to what we see Harry Reid calling people who were there last week in support of their liberties and his liberties, calling them domestic terrorists. We broke this story last night on InfoWars, the Harry Reid press conference. Let's run that sound clip right now, guys, if you can run that for me. And then there's also a story that came today from a Homeland Security advisor, and Lisa Monaco, and she is now saying if your children are confrontational, they might become terrorists. Let's play the Harry Reid clip.
So these people who hold themselves out to be patriots are not. They're nothing more than domestic terrorists. And I think that we are a country that people should follow the law. And what went up in Mesquite is not very good. I repeat, what went on up there is domestic tourism. Okay, domestic terrorism, not tourism.
Community members saw warning signs, but they didn't see them as an indicator of a problem. Whether it was a teacher hearing from a student that they were interested in traveling abroad to fight, whether it was a parent seeing a kid being more confrontational, we have to learn together and educate community members and trusted community members who can come and intervene and point that usually youth to a different path.
There we go. Now we've got Cliven Bundy on the phone. Mr. Bundy, thank you for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
Now, were you able to hear those last two clips that we played of Harry Reid calling you and everybody that was there last week domestic terrorists?
Yes, I did.
It would be funny if it wasn't so dangerous, sir.
Yeah, I don't know. It don't sound very funny to me, but, you know, I say, Harry, I guess you are right. We are upset citizens, and we are, I guess, in a riot-type mood, but we are doing it in a peaceful way with a lot of, you know, lots of inspiration and love and a lot of courage, and that's how come we was able to face Harry's army and back them down. It's not because we're militant.
That's right.
You know, riot type thing. It's because we have faith and we're looking for freedom and liberty.
I have to commend you and your family. I didn't see anybody threatening anyone else. You know, a terrorist, by definition, is somebody who uses fear, who uses the threat of violence, or who uses violence to achieve political means. You guys were not doing that. That day, we had that Saturday morning, I had an 8 o'clock interview with you, and when I got there, I was told that it was going to not happen because the sheriff had called and the family was in prayer. And when Ammon came up and addressed the crowd, he said, we've been praying about this and thinking about this, and we don't have any fear about this. You are not going to be terrorized. But he said, we don't need to take guns even to throughout any of this. So I'm asking people not to carry guns. I really admire your family's calm resolve and just backbones of steel, and yet a very, very meek spirit, like we see from people like Ron Paul.
Well, thank you. Only, you know, that's about all I can say. And you realize it's not just me. It's not just my family. There are hundreds of people with the same attitude and this same spirit. And, you know, that's what's so overwhelming is the fact that there are so many people and the spirit's the same, and they're,
yes,
you know, they're peaceful, they're love, and I mean, lovely, I guess is a good expression. They are lovely.
It really disturbs me to see the media, people. We had Reuters building this up today. The way they wrote this piece, it sounded like the only people who were armed were the demonstrators who were there. Very few, if any of them, were armed down in the gully there, and yet never talked about the federal government being armed. Never talked about the federal government pointing rifles at people for the longest time, and just essentially tried to make the federal government look like they were being reasonable, rational, and we were an angry mob. That clearly wasn't the case. But I want to ask you about this because, as I said, I watched your family. I was very impressed with the way they conducted themselves. You trained them very well. We just had this story break today. White House counterterrorism chief, and you heard this clip. She was saying that confrontational children might be terrorists, and she's warning people, as someone in Homeland Security, that if they find their children being confrontational, that they might grow up to be terrorists. As somebody who's raised 14 children, I want to get a take from you right after we come back from the break. I wonder if you ever had a child who was confrontational to you. I bet you did. See, this is coming from Lisa Monaco. She doesn't have any children, but we're going to talk to somebody who has 14 children right after the break. And I tell you, he raised them well. I saw them last week. We'll be right back with Cliven Bundy. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight here in Austin, and I have on the phone Cliven Bundy, the man who's been at the center of this dispute in Nevada about the cattle, about grazing rights, about water rights. And a lot of people don't understand that, Mr. Bundy. You have rights that are, you're not claiming that you own the land, but you do have grazing rights and you do have water rights there. A lot of people are really spinning that in a way that makes it sound like you're asserting ownership over all of that federal land.
This is a little bit confusing to people, especially in the western or eastern half of the United States, because most all of that land is privately owned, by individuals. In the West, we have what we call public land and very little private land. And of course, what's happening here, the United States is claiming that they own the private land or public land. And here in the western United States, we're saying these states are sovereign states, come under the equal footing doctrine with the original 13 states, and they are sovereign. That means that they own the land. So in other words, the argument here, does the state of Nevada own this land, or does the federal government own this land? And of course, I say you can figure this out in about 5 minutes by reading the Constitution of the United States. There's no doubt that the United States was limited, very limited, to the amount of property they could own.
Yes.
And what they could do with it.
In the article, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, the Enclave Clause, limits the government to owning land like that. And a lot of the confusion, I think, is coming from, as you point out, people in the East Over here, back east, people typically have to keep their cattle confined to fences or they're liable for damage. But where you are, you operate under open range laws in Nevada, and the default there is that the cattle are free to go wherever. And if they damage somebody's property, if those people don't have a legal fence around their property, even on the highway, then the cattle owner is not liable for that. So a very different set of laws. But I wanted to get your response to this report that came out today, and we started talking about this just before the break, about a Homeland Security advisor, Lisa Monaco, and she was speaking at Harvard University on Tuesday. And let's listen real quickly to that soundbite, and I want to get your response.
So what kinds of behaviors are we talking about? For the most part, they're not related directly to actually plotting attacks. They're more subtle. Parents might see sudden personality changes in their children at home, becoming more confrontational.
There we go. Okay. Now, as someone who has raised 14 children, have you ever seen your children as they're growing old suddenly have some personality changes and become confrontational, Mr. Bundy?
Okay, the first thing I would like to say is I've enjoyed my children from the oldest, the first one I've had, to the last one equally. I just really enjoyed my children. And, you know, when they're talking like this lady's talking, I've seen all kinds of things. I've seen my kids throw fits. I've seen them have bawl and scream. I've seen them, have problems with their dad and their mom. And I've seen them, sort of hate the world. And then on the other hand, I've seen them love the world. And so I've raised 14 of them, and they all have different moods at different times, and yes, they're learning. This is a process, and I've had to kick their butts a few times, and I've had the opportunity to love them lots of times. This is just part of family life and part of normal growing up. These kids are not perfect, neither are their parents, but this is a process that is wonderful.
Yes, and I got to say, the calmness and the resolve, as I mentioned before, you've got adult children now. And I think you've done a great job raising them. And one of the things that I really wanted to cover on this Good Friday is the fact that one of the ways that they're attacking you and the people who were there was this report by someone who was not even there saying we were strategizing and had a ploy to put women and children in the front. That was not the case. And he has now pulled that back and said, I was never there. I got there well after everything was finished, and that is true. We knew that because, we saw when he got there. That was never the case, that they were strategizing to put women and children up there. And I've got to say, people have attacked you for being a rancher, for being a Mormon, for all these different things. Everybody is trying to divide and conquer the population based on demographics. But I got to say that, as you have pointed out, the men who wrote the Constitution did it on their knees. And we had people who were Masons. They were deists, some of them. But they gave God the credit for what he did, and they appealed to God. They asked him for protection. We don't see that from people like Mayor Bloomberg, who came out this week and said, because he's given $50 million to gun control groups, that if there is a God, he's going to go straight into heaven. That's the kind of prideful arrogance that is a stench to God more than just about anything I have seen as I read the Bible. What would you say about that?
Well, any success that I've had, or my family's had, or we the people's had, we have to give that to God, because we have asked for His guidance and strength, and He's given it to us. Any other credit that would be given out here would be to we the people,
yes,
not count me, but the people here, with their prayers,
yes,
and with their efforts, and with their ability to have faith and courage enough to stand on the line. It's sure not me or my family. It has to be given to God and those people that stood and those people that pray.
Yes.
I don't know where else to give the credit.
And as Ben Franklin said, there is a God who rules in the affairs of men. And as you've pointed out, as many people have pointed out, when this country was founded, that was the mindset of the people. They asked for help from God. We had not just information warriors. That's very important that people understand what's going on. We also need prayer warriors. But let me ask you what's going on at your ranch now. We've seen reports of these cattle that were shot. We've seen some pictures that might have been mass graves for cattle out there. Can you give us an update on the damage that was done to property out there, the damage that was done to cattle?
Yes, it could. But, my main concern here, and really the emergency is that those people that pulled these guns, and these BLM and Park Service people, whoever they might have been, who had these guns pulled on we the citizens, they still have their guns, and they've escaped, and our county sheriff and other states and county sheriffs has allowed them to disappear into the United States, and those guns have not been taken away. And so that was the demand of the county sheriff before any of these things happened. It's that they disarm those people over in that government compound. He didn't do what the people asked, and that's why the people had to do it for him. And then when they did get those people in a position to take their guns away, he allowed them to go right out on that freeway and go out into the United States, across the states and counties. And the media has never reported on where they went. There's never been a county sheriff saying they're in my county. We've allowed a terrible thing to happen in America, letting those people just disappear.
Well, Mr. Bundy, that's what we've seen over and over. As we follow these types of stories quite often here at InfoWars, where we see police that exceed their reasonable powers, use deadly force in situations where deadly force is not warranted. And they're typically doing it in the cities. They're typically doing it to minorities. And we see this happen over and over again and over and over again. Just as you saw these people leave in a convoy of 80 to 100 cars, we saw them leave. The police are walking away from these criminal actions unscathed over and over again. And I think you're right. I mean, certainly the thing one of the things that backed them down last week was the exposure of the fraud and the ethical issues involving Harry Reid. But whatever their motivation, everybody needs to understand that this was a peaceful protest, a stand-up to the police state. And that's where we're seeing it everywhere. This kind of over-the-top criminal behavior that we saw there and that was going on before we got out there, that was going on while we were there, that is what people need to understand, is that we've got these armed bureaucracies, and we've got the federal government arming everyone from the Weather Service to the Postal Service to the Department of Education to the Bureau of Land Management. They are building armies of people who come after individuals. They've had a family drug out of their home in the dark of the morning because there was a mother who was no longer even living with the family that owed the Department of Education on a student loan. So they SWAT teamed the family, drug them out of their house in the dark, and put them on face down on the lawn. And this is the kind of stuff that you were seeing happening around your ranch.
Well, it's exactly, and that's why we demanded. That's why we demanded the sheriff to take these weapons away, and then he didn't do it, and so the people had to go and take that upon themselves with a great danger. But then we're demanding the sheriffs across the United States, every county sheriff, to disarm these bureaucrats, get those arms away. And now I think the call now would be for we the people to encourage our sheriff to get this done.
Yes.
Encourage your sheriff to get this job done, because if we don't get it done in the individual counties, then we're going to face all of these guns in a civil war.
Yes.
We don't want to get to that point.
Yes, absolutely. That, I think, is the key issue. I think it is the police state. That's where all this stuff comes together. We can talk about what is motivating Harry Reid and what is motivating the government. We can talk about the tactics and the techniques that they're using to deceive the public, whether it's Agenda 21 or whether it's Delphi techniques at your local county meetings. We can talk about the graft and the corruption with major corporations. I don't know if you're aware of this, Mr. Bundy, but these documents specifically mentioned getting you off of your ranch so they could use these as solar mitigation for these other solar projects. They also had a grant for $400,000 from the Walton Family Foundation, the family foundation that their fortune came from the Walmart company. So here they got a $400,000 grant that they're going to give to these park services, provided they get you off of your land. I just found that amazing to see these giant corporations teamed up to throw away. Yes.
And I don't have any comment on that because I don't know, but then that's still a little speculation. Is Harry Reid trying to cause enough trouble here with me and with we the people to actually say this is a police state? It's seems like that's what he's trying to work this all up to, where the people would accept the fact that now the United States needs to be a police state.
Yes,
because
exactly.
It seems like maybe Harry's trying to push that. In other words, another war. Is that what Harry wants?
Yes, because when they label you a domestic terrorist, we know what they do to terrorists, and they've already put the NDA. Yes, go ahead.
We also know what some of the laws are. Since 9/11, they've strengthened this to the point that just about anybody would qualify as a terrorist. And then they take unlimited power over it with a person or a group or whatever, and leaving them no liberty, and basically have an unlimited resources and unlimited power to do whatever. And if he's a terrorist, let's take him out.
Yes, and that was very troubling a couple of years ago. We had both Democrats and Republicans voting for the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, and a new section that was put in that a couple of years ago said that essentially the military could arrest anybody and hold them indefinitely without trial, and could transport them. Why? Because they perceived that we were at war. Let's play that clip from Harry Reid again, where he tries to pull up the rhetoric here. Go ahead. You guys have that clip? We're going to have that clip in just a second here. But just yesterday, Harry Reid was saying that all the people that were standing up to the police state were essentially domestic terrorists. Let's play that clip.
Keep in mind what happened up there. There were hundreds of people from around the country that came there. They had sniper rifles on the freeway. They had assault weapons. They had automatic weapons. And as one of the former sheriffs in Arizona said, and we had children and women lined up because if anybody got hurt, we wanted to make sure they got hurt first, because we want the federal government hurting women and children. This is the deal, and it's not a good one. So these people who hold themselves out to be patriots are not. They're nothing more than domestic terrorists. And I think that we are a country that people should follow the law. And what went up in Mesquite is not very good. I repeat, what went on up there is domestic terrorism. Okay, domestic terrorism.
Well, he certainly knows about terrorism, because as I was just reading earlier, there was a drone operator talking about how he was called upon to shoot men, women, and children. We know that's happening abroad all the time. And of course, it was not a plan of anyone, and there was nothing strategized about it. And in fact, you can see the videos that it did not happen to have men and women, or to have women and children, rather, on the front lines. Go ahead, Mr. Bundy.
It actually sort of makes me mad when I hear Harry talk like that. You know what he's done is he's putting a whole bunch of things together and coming up with quite a speech. I mean, definitely most of those things he's talking about are lies. And why would our United States Senator act like this in front of we the people of America? Why would a man do this? And else he's trying to stir something up. And
yes,
it definitely not. I've been around, like 3,000 people here. I've never heard anybody talk like this around me in the last couple of weeks. Never. Nobody has ever talked like this.
Well, that's true, and this is part of the vilification that they're starting, and this is a war that we're going to have to fight in the press, because first they're going to try to vilify you and your supporters. And first they assassinate your character, then they try to assassinate you. And I can see where this narrative is going. I mean, when Glenn Beck was saying that those of us who were at the front of the gate, and I was up there at the front because I wanted to capture what was being said between your son, Ammon, and this agent from the BLM. So I was up at the front, and we've got footage of that, and people were not provoking and threatening the government. It's absolutely not true. What Glenn Beck is saying about that is a lie. It's disinformation, and what he's trying to do is to demonize the people there, so that if everybody has seen you, they've seen your family, they know that you're calm and responsible individuals. But what they want to try to do is to demonize the people who were there as supporters, so they can say if something happens and they want to initiate something, they can blame it on somebody else.
Okay, now maybe I misunderstood you. You said Glenn Beck said these things, or did you mean Harry Reid said these things?
Glenn Beck said it before Harry Reid said it. I don't know if you caught it or not when you were talking to Glenn Beck, and you were trying to explain that the state and the county had jurisdiction in that area. Glenn Beck said, oh, now I understand. This is something completely different about not paying taxes. Now you're saying that you're sovereign. And then he had a guy that was there, and he said, are you saying that you're part of the sovereign citizen movement. And Mr. Bundy, you said you didn't know what that was. Let me tell you right now that the FBI has labeled the sovereign citizen movement, rightly or wrongly, as domestic terrorists for a long time. And they've been telling law enforcement officers that people who are sovereign citizens are people who will shoot them on a heartbeat. And so they've got law enforcement very afraid of that term. When they hung that label on you, he was putting a big target on your back. Well, yeah.
I'm glad you sort of informed me that. I didn't realize what was going on there. But anyway, hey,
I tell you, can you hang on? Can you hang on for just one moment? We've got a commercial break, and we're going to be right back. Can you hang on for a little bit longer?
Yes,
all right.
I will.
Thank you. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and I have on the phone Cliven Bundy, the Nevada rancher that's at the center of this dispute with the BLM, at the center, really, at the moment of our fight for our liberties against the police state. And, of course, Harry Reid is pushing back on this, calling him and everyone who was there domestic terrorists because they stood down a government that had come from all over the country and was pointing guns in people's faces, threatening to shoot them. Before we get back to Mr. Bundy, I want to let you know that this hour of the Alex Jones Show is brought to you by My Patriot Supply. Patriots everywhere are getting prepared, and they're doing it with one of my favorite companies, MyPatriotSupply.com. MyPatriotSupply.com offers high-quality survival gear and is the home of the Patriot Pantry line of emergency food storage. The food is delicious, easy to prepare, put together with GMO-free crops, and it is storable for up to 25 years. It's developed space-saving and secure food storage bins, unlike the flimsy plastic pails that you find almost everywhere else. That's My Patriot Supply. Visit mypatriotsupply.com/Alex today for special offers. The globalists are counting on you to be unprepared. Fight back. Get prepared at mypatriotsupply.com/Alex today. Now, Mr. Bundy, just before we went to break, we were talking about the interview that you had earlier this week, and I was pointing out to you that even before Harry Reid came out with the statement yesterday about the people that were there at the ranch being domestic terrorists, that as you were explaining the sovereignty issues, and I know that you believe that the sovereignty belongs in the county and with the state government as opposed to the federal government, they spun that around and said, oh, you are saying that you are above the law, that you are a sovereign citizen. And one of the guys there with Glenn Beck, I don't know his name, but if you look at the clip, you can see it. He said, are you saying that you're a member of the sovereign citizens movement, which is code word for domestic terrorists for sure? And you said at the time you didn't know anything about it. Did you want to address that?
Well, I could. I definitely am not joined with any group of terrorists.
Yes, I know.
I am an individual citizen. When I'm talking about sovereignty and of a state, I'm talking about our Constitution and our state government being we as the sovereign people of that county. And I really believe that's what our founding fathers were talking about, is it being sovereign and as individuals. And of course, we're sovereign here. I'm a sovereign citizen of Clark County, Nevada. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I am sovereignty. I believe in that.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And certainly we understand what you're talking about. And this is not, again, it's a term that is a very hot label. And it is a term that has been used for law enforcement for them to come after people and perceive them as a threat to their safety. But what you're saying is that the state of Nevada should have sovereignty over this, that as Representative Stockman, congressman from Texas, said, whenever the federal government goes out to enforce anything to enforce any rulings or any laws, they need to contract with local law enforcement. And that's what you were saying. Your son, Ammon, said to the BLM agent, he said, you have no authority here, and then pointed at the sheriff and said, you're the one with authority. We will do what you said. That's the attitude that I saw there. I understand that's what you were about. I wanted to ask you, going forward here, where's the best place for people to get updates from you? Because there's been a lot of information that's gone out. I know that you've got a Facebook page as well as a blog page, and I've seen reports that have come out in the last couple of days where you have had to, or your wife or somebody there in your family has had to come out and say that simply isn't true, and you do that, communicate people through Facebook. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's our main source of communication. My wife, I don't even understand what she's talking about, but she's saying that we've now overdid the system like Obamacare did.
Yeah.
I mean, we blew the system today.
Hey,
so
hang
I don't
on.
know what you can get or not get anything.
Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Bundy. Best wishes to you. We're going to be right back. I'm going to continue with the people that have been hanging for calls. Thank you so much, Mr. Bundy. Best wishes to you.
Yeah, I appreciate being with you and being with the people of America today. Thank you.
Thank you.
You are listening.
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and in Overdrive, we're going to try to get to some of the people that have been waiting for a very long time. I don't know if we can make it through. We're going to try to go through these calls quickly. We've got at least 5 people I want to try to get a hold of: Tack, Frank, Uncle John, JD, and Mike. So, guys, hang on. We're going to try to get through this segment and get your calls, but let's go very quickly. Tack in California, go ahead.
Hello?
Hello, Tack. Go ahead. You got the floor. Go ahead.
Hey, David. Real quickly, I see this. We only have one hope and one hope only to save America, and that's next November. We need to vote in an all-new Congress and an all-new Senate, and the people need to start volunteering and one person go to each voting polling place and take an in-poll data, and that way, if they get a good idea if the machines are rigging, because we all know the machines are rigged.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
That way, we'll be able to compare the votes that actually took place to the so-called results, and we'll know if there's fraud, and we can stop it. But Alex needs to put emphasis on getting people out to register to vote out the Congress and the Senate, because if we don't get a new Congress and a new Senate, we don't have a chance. That's the way I see it. You know?
I agree. That's a start. There's a lot of things that we can do, and we can do things at the local level as well. There's a lot of corruption in the electoral system, and we need to find better ways to monitor that. One thing that we can all do, let's not forget, jury nullification. We've got to get our right to trial by jury back, and we need people to stand up for justice and not just be rubber stamps for the judges. Thank you, Tack in California. Let's go to Frank in North Carolina. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell people about something I heard yesterday on the radio, and in regards to the Bundy situation. I listened to Rush Limbaugh for about 15 years, every chance I could get. I mean, I'd eat my lunch in the car when it was 90 degrees outside. I did that all through college, everything. But I woke up back in 2005, 2006, and realized that Rush Limbaugh was a sellout and in it for the money, and probably whoring himself out for the establishment false left-right paradigm. But he had on a guest host yesterday, and I just happened to be in a car where they were playing that. This guy, I believe his name is Mike or Mark Stein. I believe he's a Canadian.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He started talking about this Bundy situation. I couldn't believe it. He sounded like Alex Jones, and he said basically anybody that doesn't understand what's going on and doesn't support the Bundys ought to be ashamed of themselves. And I'm going to tell you that Glenn Beck, he's one part snake, one part weasel, one part rat, 100% creep. He's oddly effeminate, like Harry Reid and Lindsey Graham. And poor Mr. Bundy doesn't understand. But people like Beck. Beck is the proverbial wolf in sheep's clothing. He doesn't care anything about this country.
Well, I think you're right. Now, I didn't hear Mark Stein, but if he's talking about it being a police state issue, this is something that ought to unite people across the political spectrum. And I tell you, when they start trying to divide people along these different demographic groups and pit us against each other, that is strictly a control technique. The bigger picture, of course, there's a lot of things behind it. Agenda 21, the corruption and ethics issues behind Harry Reid, but it's also about the police state issue here. That is something that ought to unite everybody, left and right. Thank you, Frank, in North Carolina. Let's go to Uncle John in Pennsylvania.
Hello, David.
Hey.
Hats off to all you frontline info warriors.
Go ahead. What's on your mind? Thank you. What's on your mind?
All right. I was listening to Michael Savage Wednesday, and he said something that I'm surprised Alex didn't mention earlier. And there's a rare earth mine near the Bundy Ranch, like 150 miles.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And it's not so much what's underground and solar and wind, but perhaps they're after all those rare minerals as well.
You know, there's a lot of different things there. There's mineral rights, there's surface rights. All of this, there's two things going on behind this, and that is the effort to get people off of the land as part of Agenda 21, and it's also looting the country and turning it over to the Chinese and other giant corporations, and there's many different ways they can do it. Neil Kornza who is now the director of the BLM, who used to work for Harry Reid. His father was very involved in very many mining companies, as somebody pointed out earlier. Sorry I couldn't get to the last two guys there. Thank you so much for your calls. We'll be back on Sunday. There's going to be a special program that Alex has recorded. Join us then.
From the water table to our soils to the atmosphere itself,